Hi, I am Michael Kourosh and welcome to Design Santa Barbara. This week we are in Santa Barbara Design Center and I'm excited to share with you an entire episode dedicated to one of my favorite topics, art. Our first profiles we will be exploring the life of iconic Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo de Calderón was born in the outskirts of Mexico City on July 6, 1907. Her father was a German and her mother was Mexican. The third of four girls, Frida described her childhood as sad and void of love. When Kahlo was 6 years old, she contracted polio, which made her right leg shorter and thinner than the left. The illness forced her to be isolated from her peers for months, and she was bullied. While the experience made her introverted, it also made her her father's favorite due to their shared experience of living with disability, as he suffered from epilepsy. He taught her about literature, nature, and philosophy, and encouraged her to play sports to regain her strength, despite the fact that most physical exercise was seen as unsuitable for girls. Working as a commercial photographer, he also taught her how to retouch, develop, and color photographs. In 1922, Kahlo was accepted to the elite National Preparatory School. The institute had only recently begun admitting women, with only 35 girls out of 2,000 students. Kahlo focused on natural sciences with aim of becoming a doctor. She performed well academically, was a voracious reader, and became deeply immersed and seriously committed to Mexican culture, political activism, and issues of social justice. The school promoted indigenismo, a new sense of Mexican identity that took pride in the country's indigenous heritage and sought to rid itself of the colonial mindset of Europe as superior to Mexico. Kahlo enjoyed art from an early age, receiving drawing instructions from her father's friend, printmaker Fernando Fernandez, and filling notebooks with sketches. In 1925, she began to work alongside school to help her family. After briefly working as a stenographer, she became a paid graving apprentice for Fernandez. He was impressed by her talent, although she did not consider art as a career at this time. On September 17, 1925, Kahlo and her boyfriend were on their way home from school when the wooden bus they were riding collided with a streetcar. Several people were killed and Kahlo suffered near-fatal injuries. An iron handrail impaled her through her pelvis, fracturing the bone. She also fractured several ribs, her legs, and her collarbone. She spent a month in the hospital and 2 months recovering at home, before being able to return to work. Health issues plagued her for the rest of her life as a result. During her recovery, she started to consider a career as a medical illustrator, which would combine her interests in science and art, and began to paint. She had a specially made easel that enabled her to paint in bed, and a mirror was placed above it so she could see herself. Painting became a way for Kahlo to explore questions of identity and existence, and she later stated that the accident and the isolating recovery period made her desire to begin again, painting things just as I saw them with my own eyes and nothing more. Kahlo's bed rest was over by late 1927, and she began socializing with her old school friends who were now at university and involved in student politics. She joined the Mexican Communist Party and was introduced to a circle of political activists and artists, including the artist Diego Rivera, one of Mexico's most successful artists and a notable figure. Shortly after their introduction in 1928, Kahlo asked him to judge whether her paintings showed enough talent for her to pursue a career as an artist. Rivera recalled being impressed by her works, stating that they showed an unusual energy of expression, precise delineation of character, and true severity. They had a fundamental plastic honesty and an artistic personality of their own. It was obvious to me that this girl was an authentic artist. Kahlo soon began a relationship with Rivera, despite his being 42 years old, having had 2 common-law wives, and being a self-confessed womanizer. Kahlo and Rivera were married in a civil ceremony on August 21st, 1929. Soon after the marriage, in late 1929, Kahlo and Rivera moved to the rural state of Morelos, where he was commissioned to paint murals for the American ambassador. During the Mexican Civil War, Morelos had seen some of the heaviest fighting, and living through this sharpened Kahlo's sense of a Mexican identity and history. She changed her artistic style, beginning to draw inspiration increasingly from Mexican folk art. She also began to wear traditional Mexican clothing, which appealed to Rivera and helped her hide her damaged body. In 1931, Kahlo and Rivera moved to San Francisco, where American art lovers lavished them with praise and commissions. During this time, both engaged in extramarital affairs. This was a productive period for Kahlo, who further developed the folk art style she had adopted in Morelos. In addition to painting portraits of several new acquaintances, she made Frida and Diego Rivera, a double portrait based on their wedding photograph. Although she still publicly presented herself as simply Rivera's spouse rather than as an artist, she participated for the first time in an exhibition. When Frida and Diego Rivera was included in the 6th annual exhibition of the San Francisco Society of Women Artists in the Palace of the Legion of Honor. After completing his work in San Francisco, Rivera and Kahlo moved to New York for a retrospective of Rivera's work at the newly opened Museum of Modern Art. Kahlo enjoyed New York, but found Americans boring. After New York, the couple moved to Detroit, where Rivera was commissioned to create a mural for the Ford Motor Company. Kahlo's experience in Detroit was not a happy one. She disliked the area's anti-Semitism and clashed with Henry and Edsel Ford. By this time, Kahlo had become bolder in her interactions with the press, impressing journalists with her fluency in English and stating on her arrival to the city that she was the greater artist of the two of them. This time was also complicated by a miscarriage and the death of Kahlo's mother. She experimented with different techniques, such as etching and frescoes, and her paintings began to show a stronger narrative style. She also began placing emphasis on the themes of terror, suffering, wounds, and pain. Kahlo and Rivera returned to New York in March 1933, as he had been commissioned to paint a mural for the Rockefeller Center. During this time, she only worked on one painting. My dress hangs there. In May, Rivera was fired from the Rockefeller Center project amid an international scandal, as he had included Vladimir Lenin in the mural and refused to change it. He was instead hired to paint a mural for the New Workers' School. Although Rivera wished to continue their stay in the United States, Kahlo was homesick, and they returned to Mexico soon after the mural's unveiling in December 1933. Back in Mexico City, Kahlo and Rivera moved into a new house in the wealthy neighborhood of San Angel. It consisted of two sections joined together by a bridge. Kahlo's was painted blue and Rivera's pink and white. The Bohemian residence became an important meeting place for artists and political activists from Mexico and abroad. From 1934 to 1935, Kahlo experienced considerable health issues and only produced 2 works of art. She was emotionally broken when her husband engaged in an affair with her sister, resulting in 2 children. Fed up, she moved out for a year before reconciling with both. Unable to have a child herself, she eventually became a loving aunt to both children. Continuing to explore relationships outside their marriage, Kahlo had an affair with the ousted Soviet leader Leon Trotsky when he sought refuge in Mexico after being ousted by Stalin. During this time, Kahlo's work began to flourish again. In 1938, she commented, "I have produced more work than in the previous 8 years I have been married." She also made her first significant sale in the summer of 1938, when film star and art collector Edward G. Robinson purchased 4 paintings at $200 each. After a tumultuous decade of marriage, Kahlo and Rivera agreed to divorce in 1939 but remained close. Following her separation from Rivera, Kahlo moved back to La Casa Azul and began another productive period as an artist, inspired by her experiences abroad and determined to earn her own living. She painted several of her most famous pieces during this period, such as The Two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair, The Wounded Table, and Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird. During her San Francisco exhibition, Kahlo and Rivera reconciled and, both feeling more independent, decided to remarry in 1940. In 1943, Kahlo accepted a teaching position where she encouraged her students to treat her in an informal and non-hierarchical way, and taught them to appreciate Mexican popular culture and folk art and to drive their subjects from the street. When her health problems made it difficult for her to commute to the school in Mexico City, she began to hold her lessons at La Casa Azul. In her last days, Kahlo was mostly bedridden. She seemed to anticipate her death, as she spoke about it to visitors and drew skeletons and angels in her diary. The last drawing was a black angel, which biographer Hayden Herrera interprets as the angel of death. Frida Kahlo died on July 13, 1954. Rivera, who stated that her death was the most tragic day of my life, died 3 years later in 1957. Kahlo's ashes are displayed in a pre-Columbian urn at La Casa Azul, which opened as a museum in 1958. The Tate Modern considers Kahlo one of the most significant artists of the 20th century. In 1990, she became the first Latin American artist to break the $1 million threshold when Diego and I was auctioned by Sotheby's for $1.4 million. In 2016, Two Lovers in a Forest sold for $8 million.